started. Hello, and welcome to the podcast with your host, or actually to the Less is More podcast with your host, Steve Flores. There we go. All right, so today this is going to be like my first, video episode as well. So if you want to check out the video to this episode, you can go ahead and find it at on YouTube at lessismore.education. Again, you can always find me there. So this is going to be pretty good. So I'm a little bit nervous because I'm not used to like filming myself. I actually don't like filming myself. And it's weird because nobody's here watching me. But you can find me on Instagram at lessismore.education. You can also email me at lessismore.education@skiff.com. That's Skiff with 2 F's. And today is a really interesting episode. I wanted to review a book that I read on intelligence, right? So a lot of what I've been trying to do is trying to figure out, all right, not just like what are the problems with modern education, but like is there any way of fixing these problems? And so I emailed like a bunch of people that whose books I read and who I really look up to. And I found Scott Barry Kaufman. Scott Barry Kaufman is an intelligence expert. He actually has a couple of books. One of them is on intelligence. The other one is like an update of Maslow's idea. You know, everybody thinks of Maslow as like the triangle or the pyramid of needs. And he has like an interesting take where he takes that pyramid and just kind of turns it into a boat, which is pretty cool. But this book that is called Ungifted by Scott Barry Kaufman. And he basically outlines why our ideas of intelligence are not really good. And so it's really interesting to see and really interesting to kind of learn about here. And so let's take you through like just like a rough, like, all right, what are the parts of the book? It's kind of separated out into four parts. Part one is origins. So origins, just like where does intelligence come from? Like where do our ideas of intelligence come from? And it starts off with like the early ideas of intelligence, and then how that develops into IQ, and then how IQ gets like the idea of IQ kind of gets put together through like all these different tests and diagnostics and what do we know about IQ. And then he goes into part two, which is about labels. And this is kind of like where the story starts to be more about him, because Scott Barry Kaufman has an interesting life in that when he was in early elementary school, he was considered learning disabled. And so he had to go to, resources but he never felt like the intelligent aspects of himself are being recognized by the people around him. And he kind of sees how like that label of, hey, you're learning disabled, kind of like he's been kind of running away from that label as much as possible. And that's had some awesome results in that he wound up going to Carnegie Mellon for his undergrad, which is a really good school. And then he graduated from Yale with his PhD. And, so his learning disability was not really a disability. He just felt like, oh, my mind just works a little bit differently than everyone else's. So what do I have to do to kind of show that to everybody? And then he goes off and does a bunch of research to try and show everybody, all right, here's why I fell through the cracks essentially, and why I was mislabeled. I'm not learning disabled. I don't have a low IQ, or I'm not stupid, obviously, but here's all the reasons why people can fall through the cracks. And then so it starts off with being labeled and the different kinds of labels in part two. So he talks about the learning disabled, including himself, or what he was categorized as. That's not really what he is. And who is gifted, and how do we identify gifted people, and then gifted schools, and kind of goes into like how like these labels attach to people, and then these labels follow them throughout their whole educational careers, which is, pretty accurate, especially if you're being put into one of these major labels. And then he talks about engagement, because he feels like this is something that's really missing in all the intelligence research, is that there seems to be a difference between like somebody that's just sitting down and doing a test, and they don't really know why they're doing it, or they're doing a task, they don't really know why they're doing it, they just kind of have to do it, versus somebody that's really motivated. And so most people will find one topic early in their early on, that they'll just kind of latch onto and go like, all right, I want to do this all the time. And so when you do that, it winds up having all these like interesting effects, in that, people that are considered like, maybe low intelligence or low, like they are kind of falling through the cracks, they actually focus themselves in these little situations, right, where they're fully engaged. And so there's a little bit of talk about flow, which seems to come up in a lot of my books that I read about, of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and there's, and so, engagement is he kind of separates it into like 3 different chapters: passion, mindset, and self-regulation, which are 3 things that you don't really think about when you're thinking about intelligence typically, right? So if you're really passionate about something, you can be all in, right? And I saw it with my students, and you see some kids that are like, really into, band, and they really like are into like their musical instruments, and you can go see them in games, and they're performing really well, and they hold themselves to a really high standard, and they're really good at their instruments. And then you bring them into like, chemistry class or physics class, and they're kind of floundering around all over. And so there's one aspect of them that's showing really great high degrees of intelligence, and another aspect of them that's not. And there seems to be a connection between passion and motivation and engagement in that, right? And there's also a little chapter on mindset in, what are the kinds of mindset? Like, can you have a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset? And he goes into the definitions of those. And I've seen those ideas play out in a bunch of other books as well. And so, it's really interesting to think about, all right, how does your mindset determine how you're going to succeed in not just like life and school, but like in your career, or maybe in your relationships? It's a really interesting idea to think about. And there's a lot to be said about the benefits of having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And then self-regulation. Self-regulation is probably one of the big ones, right? Self-regulation has a lot to do with how much you can control your own like desires. And there's like an infamous like marshmallow test. And if you read anything about psychology, you'll probably, or go take a psychology class in college, you'll probably learn about the marshmallow test. And it's basically this study that was done where you give like kids really, really young, we're talking about like 3-4 years old, and you put them in a room by themselves with a plate in front of them, and you have one marshmallow. And then you go, all right, I'm gonna leave, and if you eat this marshmallow, it'll be the only one you get. But if that marshmallow is still there in 10 minutes, I'll give you 2 marshmallows, all right? So double the amount. And so researchers looked, and they saw some kids like just ate it immediately. Some kids like held out, kind of long before they ate it. Some kids, would distract themselves with other things, and they could hold out, right? And then wait for the person to come back and give them 2 marshmallows. And so there's like a delay of gratification that's happening there. And some kids are naturally better at it than others. And they track these kids throughout their entire lives, right? So, this is like a really long longitudinal study. And what they found was that the kids that were able to hold out longer, or for the entire time, had way better outcomes. So they had higher paying jobs, they had higher degrees, they had more stable relationships, they had like all these benefits. And the kids that didn't, there was like higher incidences of them being jailed, there's more crime involved, there's like, even like their health was worse overall. And so this self-regulation aspect is really important. And there's like some hopeful news in that you can take kids, to a limited degree, you can take kids that have no self-regulation, you can show them how to regulate themselves. And that might have there might be some connections between that and another book that I'm reading by an author named Peter Gray called Free to Play, which I'll kind of weave in through this as I go on, because there seems to be a lot of correlations between this book, and between, my favorite education system, which is Finland's education system. Like, there seems to be like this thread that's going through all of these things. And I'll kind of try to hold off on talking about those things until the end. And the last thing is ability, or part 4 is about ability, and how he talks about, like, all right, deliberate practice, right? So how much does deliberate practice matter? And it turns out a lot. If you've ever tried to learn anything or learn a skill, spending time learning that skill is the most important thing. Now, he does talk a little bit about general intelligence and talent, and how those are kind of important and can be factors too. But if you take somebody that is talented but they don't practice, and you take somebody that starts off as maybe not talented but they practice a lot, the second person is going to do better or have better outcomes than the first person. So a lot of success is not just like what your baseline is, but it's also how much effort you put into it. And that's true for everyone, and then every once in a while you'll get those people that have both, right? Maybe they have like physical or natural talents towards something, and they have a really strong work ethic. And we see those people come out in society all the time. They're like people like, famous, athletes, so like your LeBron James or your Kobe Bryant, and you also see them in in business, so like people like Elon Musk, and who have like this high motivation and this high like drive, as well as like these natural talents that he's worked on and developed throughout a long time. And then so we see those guys rise up a lot. But most of us, can overcome a lot of our limitations just through practice and just through hard work. The other thing that he talks about in here is creativity, which is something that I didn't really think about. And he really got me thinking a lot about creativity and how that matters with ability, and how creativity is one of these things that doesn't get captured in your standard IQ tests. But creativity matters a lot, especially in certain domains. And then he ends it with a new definition of intelligence. And his new definition of intelligence is the dynamic interplay of engagement and abilities in pursuit of personal goals. And that's like, it's an interesting view of intelligence because it's very like personalized. And, one of the things that I want to talk about before I get into like his new definition was a little bit more on like IQ and what does IQ miss, right? When everybody thinks intelligence, everybody thinks, like book smarts or your IQ test or your score. And that those are very narrow in his opinion, because there's a lot that's missing in there. And he lists out all these parts that are kind of like things that are missing in an IQ test. So if you think about an IQ test sits you down in a room, right, with the test in front of you, and there's usually like not a whole lot of inputs all around you, and you have to sit there and work with this test. And if you look at the questions are kind of like odd and all over the place, and they don't map onto real life at all. And that becomes one of his criticisms. And so one of the big criticisms that he has is that IQ tests have you focused a lot on your working, like they overload your working memory and then have you do reasoning on top of that, right? And so if you're really smart in this way, you're going to have a really high IQ score. But they found that if you take the working memory load off, and you can take somebody with a low IQ and give them a different reasoning test, that's more natural to their natural environment or more fits closer to their natural environment, or you give them the ability to like write things down so they don't have to hold things in their head as they do reasoning, their reasoning scores start to go up, right? And go up significantly. So working memory is like your ability to kind of hold information and then recall it and then apply it to like a novel situation. But that's all taking place in your mind. If you think about real life doesn't really work that way. Let's say you have like a boatload of information that you want to like keep track of or that you want to work with. Now, the worst thing that you can do is just try to memorize it all, because that's really hard to do. What most people do is they take that information and they write it down, or they put it in a place where you can reference it easily. And then when you need it, you pull it out and then you can start working with that information. And this is kind of one of the criticisms of IQ tests, is that it has you do all of that stuff more or less in your head, right? And you'll be able to write some things down, but it's, it's kind of limited. And there's also like this time component that, you only have a certain amount of time to get these done. So what's gonna, can you do all that in the set amount of time? And so you can unload your working memory and then your reasoning skills go up. And I used to tell my students this all the time, like just write it down, write these things out. And I tried towards the end of my career to focus more on, like if you want to go use your notebook on the test, go for it, like that's fine. And with the idea being kind of like this, I didn't know that this is what I was doing, but it turns out this is what I was doing. Is I was like, I don't really care so much about what you've memorized as like how much of this information can you apply to new situations. And so I was trying to relieve their working memory while trying to give them reasoning and test their reasoning skills, which is the most important part for my own particular topic. And he also found that if the context of when your intelligence is being measured really matters, and then how much time you're given also really matters. So one of the ways I think about this is like through video games, because that's what I love doing, like pretty much my whole life. I don't get much time to do it now, but that's something that when I was trying to recall, like, how does this apply in my life? I started thinking about video games, because one of the things that I realized is that if I have a video game and like the mechanics of it are like kind of new to me, when I first start trying to play it, I suck. I just like get killed over and over again, or I lose, like I don't do the task that's necessary. And then at first it's just like, okay, I gotta like practice. And the more time that I spend with it, the more I start to see like, oh, there's patterns to all of this, right? Oh, okay, every time I do this thing comes up, right? Or every time I jump here, I get hit by this thing. Or every time like there's this situation, I see this thing, right? And so you start to see these patterns. And if you talk to people that play video games, they'll like, it's pretty, some of them are kind of hilarious. Like if you see, like I play a lot of like role-playing games and games where you can like just roam around and explore the environment. And one of the things that's funny about the at least the older games was it was pretty obvious that there's a hidden object behind certain like walls or environments, because it would just be all discolored and stuff. So then that kind of gets applied like when you are out in the world and you start to notice like, oh, like that part of the fence is different. And you start to think, oh, maybe there's treasure there. I don't know, right? Like, and so, but it like there is some level of transference that can happen when you do one task and you learn it really well, and then try to apply like a similar task to it in a different way. And IQ tests kind of like miss that out, because you only have a limited amount of time. You can't get used to the test unless you've taken a bunch of IQ tests and then take this one. And so that you're familiar with it. You're familiar with the game. Most IQ tests don't work that way. And then most IQ tests are considered invalid if you were to do that. So like, oh, like you spent all this time learning this thing, but because you've learned it, now you've invalidated your results, which he kind of calls that kind of thinking into question. I was like, well, what are we doing here? Right? Like, what's the goal here? And so, yeah, so this time and then context is also what's important. So you can take people and you can show them abstract math, right? And this is kind of what was my frustration with how math was being taught in high schools was, you have I can see that for a lot of people, it's really frustrating. You have an equation, you have X, Y, and Z, and you're just like, I don't know. Like, I solve for X, it's right there. I don't, what do I do, right? And it's hard, because when you go out into the real world, you don't see that. You don't see X, Y, and Z everywhere. What you see are apples. You see, desks. You see tables. You see, lights. You see things that have meaning behind them. And so when you try to extract those out, then things stop to make sense. And he starts to highlight scenarios where people will take two tests that are testing the exact same thing. One of them is out of context for people, and one of them is in context for people. So trying to teach math using XYZ versus trying to teach math by purchasing a bunch of items in a store, right? And then finding patterns in the store. Those, you're doing the exact same thing, right? You're doing algebra, but because one is in context and the other one is not, they found that, people that are doing things in context understand it and can reason really well, right? And can pass this test and get a score equivalent here to what would be a high score over here on this, on this just little written test. And so again, that's calling into question, this idea of intelligence. He also found that if you take students that are kind of like in a college, right? Let's say a bunch of students are going to UCLA, and you try to track the students that have low SAT scores versus students that have high SAT scores. What tends to happen is that the students with higher SAT scores tend to have better outcomes in college, right? And so that's if there's no interventions or anything at all. But what they found was that if you take these lower students and you try to find what kind of character strengths they have, and you provide them interventions where they can utilize their character strengths, they start to perform as well as the students that had higher SAT scores or better. So one example was if you take a bunch of students that are, have the same background, right? Maybe they're all Hispanic and they came from low income schools. And you take these students, and because they're very social, you allow them to work together, take classes together, socialize together, and use each other to learn. Then these students start to perform as well or better than an isolated student over here that had a high SAT score. And so, you can use character strengths to kind of make up for maybe some other deficits, and you can get equal or better results, which is really interesting. And so your own character strengths can be utilized to be successful, and that's great news, and we'll talk about the implications of that later on for what does that mean about schools, right? So in schools, in modern day education, are we teaching students about their character strengths and showing them how to take their own particular character strengths and apply them in a way that allows them to be successful in their own goal that they want to accomplish? The answer to that is no, definitely not. And just the structure of our school just doesn't allow for that at all. There's no time to do all that. And time is one of these really important concepts, especially when you want to rethink school, because, it matters a lot for a lot of reasons. And you only have a limited amount of it. What are you going to use it for? Other kind of criticisms is that he found that if you look at people that are prodigies or savants, like, students that have like Asperger's, but they can do certain things really, really well, or certain students that have learning disabilities. These students or these people, they have a skill that is really, really advanced, right? They can either like draw or play music really well, or, do all these things really well. But one of the things that he found is that all of these group of people tended to have low IQs, right? But his point was, because they have low IQs, they're able to have amazing skills. And he makes an argument for that in the book, which I found like was pretty interesting. And because it's like gets into the weeds and details of like their neurobiology, like how their brains actually work and take in information, which I found was interesting. He also found that you can have success in social or clerical or creative ventures, and those people that are successful in those fields tend not to have super high IQs, right? Like, it's not related to IQs whatsoever. Creative people tend not, it's not that they tend not to have high IQs, it's just that their IQs are all over the place, right? So IQ and your creativity and your ability to create like art and even like computer programs and things like that, like those two things are just not really related. And so he cites like some reasons for why that could possibly be. And then he cites also like learning quickly from experience. Like, what are we talking about there? Because there's different kinds of learning. There's like implicit learning versus explicit learning. And there are certain times where implicit learning is more valuable than explicit learning. And, or you can learn better during explicit learning. And again, that kind of goes back to, Peter Gray and his ideas of, hey, if you give kids freedom, like free time to play on their own, unsupervised, you don't have to have a parent there, they start to learn all these social skills that they wouldn't have learned and they can't learn when adults are around. And so I found like a big like connection there between Peter Gray's work and what Scott Barry Kaufman was highlighting here. And that has a lot to do with like just understanding play in general, right? So when you have a group of kids and they're mixed age and you put them together, well, what do they want to do? They want to play, right? The goal is, let's keep playing for as long as we can. And anything that interferes with that play should be kind of like casted out, right? So if you're all playing a game, like let's say tag or whatever, and you are all chasing each other and somebody's it, and then that person tags somebody and they say, oh, you didn't really hit me, or you didn't really touch me, and they keep running around, and then they do that to a bunch of the other kids, then that kid, they're not going to invite him to play anymore. He's like, no, you can't play with the rules. You're not really like obeying them. You can't play next time because you don't know how to play right, right? And then, the kid is starting to learn like, oh, if I do this, then this happens. And then if I see, oh, all these kids are playing by these rules and they're having fun, they continue to have fun, I got ostracized because I couldn't do that, so I don't get to have fun. So next time I'm going to do that. Now, all that thinking isn't explicit in their heads, it's implicit, right? It's like they experience it versus somebody is sitting there pulling them aside and saying, the reason why these kids are not playing with you is because you are not playing right? That's not what's happening. It's like it's more of an implicit. And then you start to see that like these social skills that the kids use to interact with each other are kind of like naturally being developed between each other. And that's really important if you want really well socially developed kids. The problem is like if you start introducing adults in there and the adult starts to see like unfairness or something, right? And if an adult were to like take that same tag game and then interfere and then stop the game and then grab the kid and say, you're not playing right or whatever. Now, what they've done is they've just shown the entire group that if things don't go right, it's up to an authority figure to tell us what to do, right? And that lesson gets promoted when they get older and older and older, right? And this is kind of like what I see like with some people's ideas of what they're trying to accomplish today, especially with like some movements that are out there of like, oh, if something's not right, then it's up to the government to fix it. Like we can't fix it. Like we have no power to fix it. We don't have the ability to fix it. And that's not really a good lesson to learn, because that's not really how things work, right? Like changes occur with people first, and then the people change the government. It's not the other way around, you know? It's not top down. And I feel like that causes so much problems when there's so much top down stuff. Yeah, and so that, you know, causes all sorts of other issues in that, you know, now kids, they learn, oh, I don't have to like fix, or I don't have to learn conflict resolution because somebody else will do it for me, right? And so that's a problem. I'm like, come on, like we need it. Like these are valuable skills to teach kids, and they're implicitly learned, and they occur during play naturally, which is, you know, kind of cool to see. And you know, we should give students opportunities to do that in schools. We really don't. Like every chance we get, we remove those opportunities. You know, like if you look at education, public education 50 years ago, you know, like a third of the day was just kids playing with each other. And now it's like, Jesus, you know, like if you get an hour in a day, like that's like, whoa, that seems to be like the average, you know? And finally, his other criticism is motivation and inspiration, or domain-specific expertise. Okay, so the idea here was, if you're not really motivated to take a test, why should you try very hard on it? All right, somebody sticks you in a room and says, here, you have to take this IQ test. And you're like, I don't know why I'm taking this. I'm not really interested in this. I don't really care about what's on this, right? Like, how much am I really gonna try on this? And that's kind of like where the motivation, inspiration thing, I'm like, there's nothing inspiring me to do well on this task here. So of course, I'm not gonna put my full effort. And of course, the test is not gonna be able to measure my full capabilities in terms of my intelligence. So there's another like problem with IQ tests and IQ measures. And he does go into a little bit of like what's called G, which is generalized intelligence. G is like this combination of fluid reasoning, working memory, and abstract relational complexity. And it's related to learning new complicated information. And if you have a high G score, then you're able to like learn things better, quicker. Especially new things quicker. And G has been positively correlated with like a bunch of things, like your family income, your socioeconomic status, your school and occupational performance, your military training assignments, your law abidingness, your helpful habits, your illness and mortality. All of those things have better outcomes if you have a higher G score. And then there's things that are negatively correlated, like welfare, psychopathology, crime, inattentiveness, boredom. Boredom was a really interesting one, delinquency and poverty. Because I see a lot of bored kids out there. I'm always like, oh man, like why are you, you know, you can't find anything right now? No, it's an interesting insight there. Is that, yeah, I don't want to go too far in that direction. But his claim was like, look, like you can look at all those outcomes in the G score, and say like, oh, it's the fault of the G score, right? So if somebody has a higher general intelligence, then they're going to have all those other things. But that doesn't really work out, because all of those aspects are all correlated with each other. Like your family income and your socioeconomic status, those are correlated with one another. Your school and occupational performance is related to your family income. Like all of those are all correlated to each other. So it's hard to say what causes what, right? Did you have a high G score to begin with, and that led to you having better school and occupational performances? Or was it the fact that you grew up in a household that had a higher family income that created a situation where you have a higher G score, and then therefore you started to have, better outcomes in school, right? So where does it start? That's the problem, right? It's like, yeah, all these things are correlated, but they're all correlated with one another. It's a web. It's not this causes this, causes this. It's not linear like that, right? These are all like just kind of connected together. So it's hard to say like what started out. Like, is this a chicken or an egg problem, right? That seems to be like the problem. And I think that's a very, powerful argument right there to have. And and there's like all these, and I guess his bigger claim is like, look, these labels that we give to people because, we give them an IQ test early in their age follows them throughout their whole lives, right? So you give a first grader a low IQ test, then they are stuck with that label, and then everybody treats them like they're of low IQ. So the standards for them are all lowered, right? It's not only standards from their teachers, but standards from their parents and expectations from their parents all get lowered as well. And then that tracks with them their entire lives, right? So they keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Whereas if you put the label of, oh, this student has a high IQ, then everybody treats them that way, right? Their parents set higher expectations for them. Their teachers have higher expectations and give them more and more challenging work so that they can, cultivate that intelligence that they have. And then that stays with them. And, so he uses the phrase like, look, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, right? And it's these labels that are causing that. And so we got to get rid of these labels, right? And that's why he kind of like, put his definition of intelligence as the dynamic interplay of engagement and abilities in pursuit of personal goals. And, he's really focuses on that, on like that personal stuff. And so he says there's like, all right, there's 4 tenets to this. Number one, or to that definition, is like the core aspect of the self is the core aspect of human intelligence, right? So there's not, he makes the claim like, look, we're spending all this time on all these diagnostic tests, and they don't really measure a ton in terms of like the potential outcomes. Like things are correlated, but they're not correlated 100%, right? You can have people with that are lower on the IQ scale that wind up being successful in the future, right? Now, is that likely? Well, the statistics say no, that's not very likely, but it can happen, which means that there is other things that are going into your success into the future, right? And things that we shouldn't put up these artificial barriers by putting on these labels onto people and causing that to hold people back, essentially. Other things that he talks about is like, look, like you have your own individual personal characteristics. So there are certain things that you're going to be good at and certain things that you're going to be bad at as a consequence of those characteristics. But the other thing that you got to think about is that you're not just one, solid metal ball, right? That just stays a metal ball, right? You're fluid. People's characteristics kind of change with time, especially with their age. Like personality traits change significantly from the time you're 5 to the time you're 18. So like you're still being molded, you're still like fluid, and you're still fluid for quite a long time, even after you finish with your formal schooling. So there's not like, by putting these labels, you're categorizing them as one thing, and you're eliminating the potential that they have for future success. And that's a really big problem right there. And people evolve with time, and you probably have had this experience with yourself, where like this is what I always told my students, like, look, who I was 10 years ago was an idiot. They're dumb, right? 28-year-old Steve Flores was just dumb. I don't know how else to put it, right? But if you were to ask 28-year-old Steve about 18-year-old Steve, you'd say that guy was an idiot. That guy didn't know anything. And you ask 18-year-old Steve about 8-year-old Steve, and you go like, oh yeah, that was just a blob of a person. And that's true for most people that I find, is that most people go look at their past selves and go like, I made a lot of bad decisions, right? But now I am better. Now I'm improved. Now I know a little bit more, right? And the goal is to be able to say that every 10 years. I want 48-year-old me to think of me now to be an idiot, because that means that I've evolved with time. I've gotten better with time. And that should be like, that personalization should, is like kind of highlighted here in the first tenet and in one of the other tenets as well. The second tenet is engagement and ability are inseparable throughout human development, dynamically feeding off each other as we engage in the world. And yeah, I think that's very true, right? You're going to want to pursue more the things that you love to do. And because you pursue it, your abilities to do those things will also increase, right? That's the value of habit, of doing things over and over again, of putting in that effort, that practice, that deliberate practice, right? And those two things feed off of each other, right? So taking your intelligence and then just hooking it up to one specific domain doesn't really make sense. And the next tenet is both controlled and spontaneous cognitive processes can be adaptive for acquiring a personal goal. So a lot of books will talk about your brain as being separated into an older part of your brain and a newer part of your brain. And your older part of your brain is instinctual and feeling and intuitive. And your newer part of your brain is more cognitive, it's more thinking, it's more logical and processing. And traditionally, when we talk about intelligence, we talk about that newer part and how well developed that newer part is. But the reality is that both of those parts of your mind, both of those aspects of your brain, contribute to your overall intelligence. And I've seen like other books to kind of talk about like, your automated processes or your automated thinking processes versus like your novel thinking process. Like think about like learning a skill. Like let's say you're playing a piano or learning how to play an instrument of some sort. And so when you start to play, at first, you have to think about everything, right? You have to think about, all right, where am I going to put my fingers? What's my timing? I have to look at the paper and see like, where am I at? And I have to and it's very slow and very deliberate. You put in thousands of hours into this, and then you just put your hands on the instrument and you can just go, and you don't have to think about it. So you're taking a lot of that stuff that was in that newer part of your brain, and then you're offloading it into the older part of your brain where it's more automated and more automatic. And then that allows you to play well and play fluidly and to do better. And so that's one of the things that I thought was really important and significant in terms of like, how do we think about intelligence? Next is number 4. There are no 10-year rules or creativity thresholds in which a person must attain a certain amount of knowledge or score above an arbitrary level on a standardized test to reach his or her personal goals. Yes, I think that's very good, right? And that you can't have your success be dependent on a frozen period of time, right? And this goes along with what a lot of other books I've read on philosophy even talk about, in that you shouldn't compare yourself to somebody else. Like, I shouldn't compare myself to Joe Rogan, even though we both podcast. That's kind of a stupid comparison to do. I shouldn't compare myself against anyone other than myself, right? And that's what I want to do. That's the only reasonable way of going through life, is comparing yourself to yourself. Comparing me right now to me 10 minutes ago, or not even 10 minutes ago, like 5 days ago, a week ago, a year ago, 10 years ago, like I was doing earlier, right? And so how do we compare? Like, if we compare ourselves to our past selves and continue along that path of continual growth and improvement and getting better at things, then that is a pathway to success. That is a way of improving our intelligence with time. Our intelligence isn't one static number, one thing in one particular time. And so how does all of this stuff apply to education, right? Well, let's talk about like some previous education systems, like, I don't know, Finland. I like talking about Finland. And I've been reading a book on a bunch of others, like Singapore, Canada, Shanghai, and it also has Finland in there as well. But the Finnish system, let's talk about labels, because the labels thing was really important and to me. One of the things that the Finland system was doing to kind of like address the label situation was special education wasn't dedicated to people that were given a diagnostic test and told to have some kind of disability. Special education was for everybody, literally for everybody. Let's say you take a class and it's like a six or 7 week class, and at the end of the 7 weeks, you bomb the class, like you fail, right? Then you get put into special education, like just like that, right? And the goal of special education is to get you out of special education. That's the goal. Is they're going to go in, they're going to figure out why you failed, and then they're not going to hold you back. They're going to go put you into the next class, but they're going to assign a counselor with you to meet with you every week to go like, all right, this was the problem. This is how you fix the problem. Are you modifying your behavior to fix the problem, to find a workaround around like maybe some deficit that you had over here? And once you get the skill of doing that workaround, then you're no longer in special education. You are classified back as like regular population, right? And the special education label is not really seen then as a negative or as something that sticks with you for your entire life, right? By the time, like if you take like 100 Finnish students, by the time they graduate from secondary school, about half of them have been through special education. So special education doesn't have that stigma that's attached to it like it does over here, where you have to have like meetings and you have to have like labels and you have to be tested constantly and you have to, like it's not like that. And that's one way of taking this idea of like labels and just kind of like changing it up so that everyone can succeed, right? Oh, you're not permanently disabled. You just had a rough time and we're going to help you get through it so that you can be successful for the rest of your life. And in that preventative system, it's also amazing because if you catch those things early and you treat them early, then you don't have to invest all the time and money and energy in trying to help that student later on. And that seems to be the problem with what I was seeing in special education is that, look, special education, it just kind of sticks with you for a long time, and then I had to like go out and get pulled out of my classroom to have a meeting about a student that's in special education to come and talk about their plan and then what I have to do to adjust my teaching to that particular student and you know, and make sure that they're serving their needs and all that. I'm like, okay, what are we doing? Are we trying to bend the whole world, you know, to the needs of your child? Or are we trying to mold your child to be able to be successful in the world, right? One of those things is possible. The other thing won't work, hasn't worked, and has cost us billions of dollars in resources. So let's think about this. Let's think about it critically, all right? What is it exactly that we're doing here? Other things that I found like were pretty interesting and kind of like applicable. You know, there was one part where we talk about lower SAT, you know, students with lower SAT scores having like using skills to become successful later on. And you know, I actually have like a little story on that. When I was in college, I had like this little like study group that I was a part of, and it was really cool. Like everybody in that class, we focused on chemistry classes, and we would take our chemistry classes together, and then we would study together, and we would try to help each other like get better and prepare it out for the class, for the tests. And I was talking to one of the girls in there because she came in a little bit later, and I was like, oh, like what school were you at before? Because, you know, usually if students transfer in later, they were like at a local, like, you know, community college or, you know, have some kind of like story about that. And she was like, oh, I was at UC Irvine before I came here. And then, but before that, I started out in college in Harvard. And I was just like, what? We're at Cal State Fullerton. What are you talking about? Like, what? Like, why would you go from Harvard to UC Irvine to Cal State Fullerton? It blew my mind. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. She was like, yeah, you know, like at Harvard, I had a hard time because everybody was so competitive that nobody wanted to work with me or help me out in my classes. So I was like, this doesn't feel good. So I started going to UC Irvine, and then UC Irvine, I started to feel the same thing happening, but to a lower extent. So I was like, I don't like that. So I came here to Cal State Fullerton, and I love it because you guys, like, look, we all study for these classes together, and we all work hard for these classes together and help each other out. And we use each other to make ourselves better. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's what I really like. And that's why I'm staying here. And I was like, wow, that blew my mind right there. Right. And that's somebody who had to take the initiative for herself and go like, look, I can't be successful here unless I am surrounded by other people that are of the same mindset as I am. And so I'm gonna have to go out and find it. And she found it, you know, in us, in our little Cal State school, and which is like, you know, I found that was like really interesting, really important. Other things that I wanted to point out here is like, again, all of this really matches up with Peter Gray's ideas and Finland's ideas on play, right? It seems like a lot of the research that I'm reading out there or that I'm seeing, or all the books that I'm reading, lead to this conclusion of we got to give kids a lot of free time to play that is unencumbered by adults, that is in mixed age groups. That seems to be universal across everything that I see. And the way Finland does it is like, look, you have 45 minutes of instruction, then you have 15 minutes of free play, and you have 45 minutes of instruction, then you have 15 minutes of free play, then 45 minutes, then an hour of free play, then 45 minutes of instruction, and you go home, right? And that's like, wow, that's really, like, that's a lot of free play, right? And that free play allows them to socialize and allows them to work. And there's another story that I heard about Japan and how they deal with, like, you know, because sometimes bullying happens. Sometimes, and if they see two kids getting into a conflict and they see like, oh, they're both roughly about the same age, just let them figure it out, you know, like just let them go at it. And because it can't be that adults or that other people above you solve all your problems for you, right? But if they see that there is a power imbalance, right? So you have like a 12-year-old picking on an 8-year-old, then they go like, what they do is they take another 12 or 13 or 14-year-old nearby and they go, hey, look at what's happening there. Go fix that, right? The adult isn't the one going in there and breaking up the fights or trying to save people. It's another student that's going in there and going, hey, what you're doing isn't right, right? Cut it out. And that allows them to figure out, all right, in terms of like, all right, am I behaving appropriately, right? And if I'm not, it's my peers that are going to adjust my behavior. And that's really powerful right there. But again, it's always like, adults, I think we're doing too much, right? And this is kind of why I named the podcast Less is More, because I think there's too much stuff out there. And that's what was making my job so hard to do, was that there's all these demands coming from above. And I started to feel like I had less and less control of my classroom. And I was like, what are we doing? And then I started to see the results of the students, and they were getting worse and worse and worse in their ability to work, or their ability to stay motivated, or their ability to pay attention, or their even just like their math and reading skills were deteriorating. I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, this is not right. There has to be a better way. And when I look out into the world, I see, oh yeah, there's a lot of things that we can do better, right? And a lot of the things that we do in this state go counter, right? Not just like are like neutral, they go against what the research shows, right? Helps out the kids the most. And I'm like, this is why I want to share this out. This is what I get passionate about. This is why I'm starting this YouTube channel, why I have the podcast, why, I'm reaching out as much as I can. And, and I can't do this by myself, to tell you the truth. I need your help as well, right? So if you're willing to reach out and help me out, either by letting me interview you, or if you have like some resources that you want to share out with me, awesome. As far as this book, if you're a teacher, I think it'd be worth it to read this book, Ungifted by Scott Barry Kaufman. If you're an administrator, for sure you should be reading this. This should be like required reading. I really think so. And even if you're a counselor as well, like for sure. It really changed, I think as a teacher, if I had read this earlier, it would have changed my mind about like what an IQ test is and what it means for students and how little it means really. And I think it was like a pretty profound book right there. So from time to time, I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to be giving book reviews, and I don't like giving things like scores because that's kind of weird, because a lot of these books, like they're not even on the same topics or cover the same material. So it's kind of weird to give a comparative score in that way. Hey, that's another thing I got from Scott Barry Kaufman, right? But like on its own, I think it was a very powerful book, very good book. And it seems to correlate a lot with what I'm seeing that's being done in school systems that are being successful, right? And this was great. And if you want to reach out to me, again, you can find me on Instagram at lessismore.education. You can find me at Less is More Education on YouTube. And I wanted to wish good luck to Agnes Gonzalez, who's running for the school board. I wanted you guys to check out my other podcast, The Generational Divide. Especially check out Telomania, because that one hit really hard for me. So if you want to see me get a little bit emotional, you can see me there with my co-host, Jason Pasigan. And this is where, it's literally like different generations talking to each other and trying to see like what we can learn from each other. And like I said before, I'm looking for stories from you. If you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a counselor, an administrator, whatever it is, like reach out to me. I think, we have a lot to talk about. And even if I don't interview you, if you were to provide me like with some input on, what your experiences have been, I think that would be very valuable. You can also find me at my website, which is lessismore.education. So the .education is actually like instead of .com, it's just .education. So just type into your browser lessismore.education. And there you can find my website, and you can reach out to me there as well. You can find the podcast there as well. And if you really like this, if you found this informative, give me a thumbs up. Reach out to me. Let me know if you see that I'm doing something pretty crappily. Let me know about that too, but in a constructive way, please. And this has been Less is More Education with your host, Steve Flores.